My name is Ava Williams. I'm 32 years old, and I never imagined that one stormy night would completely change everything I thought I knew about my family's legacy. You see, when a famous chef got stranded in my town, the only place to eat was my family's diner, and what happened next was something I could never have predicted. I had been running Williams' family diner for 5 years after my mother passed away, and every single day felt like a battle to keep the doors open. The paint was chipping, the booths were worn, and some nights I'd sit alone in the empty dining room wondering if I was fighting a losing battle. But on that particular Thursday evening in October, when the rain was hammering against the windows and the wind was howling through the streets, I had no idea that everything was about to shift in ways I couldn't even imagine. If you've ever felt like giving up on something you love, hit that subscribe button and drop a like on this video, because what I'm about to share with you might just change the way you see your own struggles. Have you ever wondered what it takes to hold on to a dream when everyone around you thinks you should let it go? That's exactly where I was that night, wiping down the same counter I'd been wiping down since I was 16 years old, thinking about all the memories baked into those walls. My mother used to say that every meal we served carried a piece of our family's heart, and I wanted so badly to believe that still mattered in a world obsessed with fancy restaurants and Instagram-worthy dishes. But the truth was, I was barely making enough to cover rent, and the bank had sent me another letter that week reminding me of what I already knew. The diner had been in our family for 43 years, passed down from my grandmother to my mother, and then to me. We specialized in comfort food, the kind of meals that reminded people of home, of Sunday dinners, of simpler times when food wasn't about presentation, but about love. My mother's pot roast recipe had been perfected over decades. Her apple pie had won county fair ribbons, and her chicken soup was legendary in our small town of Maple Ridge. But lately, even our most loyal customers were showing up less frequently, tempted by the new chain restaurants that had opened up on the highway. I couldn't blame them for wanting something different, something new, but it broke my heart a little more each time I saw another empty table. That night, October 13th, the weather forecast had predicted severe storms, and they weren't wrong. By 6 o'clock, the rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of downpour that makes you wonder if the sky has split open. Thunder cracked overhead like the world was angry, and lightning illuminated the empty street outside my diner in brief, ghostly flashes. I should have closed early, but something made me stay open. Maybe stubbornness, maybe hope, or maybe just the fear that closing even one night early would make it easier to close forever. I stood behind the counter, watching the storm rage outside, my reflection staring back at me in the dark window glass. Little did I know that in less than an hour, a black rental car would pull up outside, and the man who stepped through my door would see something in my mother's recipes that I had almost forgotten was there. But that moment hadn't arrived yet, and I was still just a woman alone in an empty diner, wondering if tomorrow would be the day I finally admitted defeat. The storm outside was fierce, but the storm inside my heart was fiercer, and I didn't know which one scared me more. Blurry? When the headlights cut through the rain and a sleek black car pulled into the parking lot, I assumed someone was just turning around or checking their phone. Nobody came to Williams' family diner on a Thursday night anymore, especially not in weather like this, and especially not in a car that looked like it cost more than my annual revenue. The car sat there for almost 2 minutes, engine running, windshield wipers working frantically against the deluge, and I wondered what kind of person would be out driving in conditions like these. Then the driver's door opened, and a figure emerged, hunched against the wind and rain, running toward my front entrance with a leather jacket pulled up over his head. When he burst through the door, soaking wet and slightly breathless, I got my first look at Marcus Reed, though I didn't know his name yet. Before you skip ahead, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that like button, because the next part of this story gets even more unbelievable. Have you ever met someone who completely changed your perspective on everything you thought you knew? That's what was about to happen to me, though in that moment, all I saw was a drenched stranger shaking water from his dark hair and looking around my humble diner with an expression I couldn't quite read. He was probably in his early 40s, well-dressed despite being soaked through, with the kind of presence that filled a room even when he wasn't trying. His eyes scanned the empty tables, the faded photographs on the walls, the old jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in years, and for a second, I felt embarrassed by how worn everything looked, but then his gaze landed on me, and he offered a tired smile that seemed genuine. "I'm so sorry to barge in like this," he said, his voice carrying a slight East Coast accent that sounded out of place in our small Colorado town. "My GPS sent me on what it promised was a shortcut, and now I'm completely lost. My phone has no service, and I haven't eaten since breakfast." He pulled out his phone as if to demonstrate, showing me a screen with no signal bars and a maps app that had frozen on a route that looked nothing like where we actually were. I could see the frustration in his shoulders, the exhaustion around his eyes, and despite my own troubles, I felt a pang of sympathy for this stranger who looked like he'd had a very long day. "Is there any chance you're still serving food?" he asked, glancing at the clock on the wall that showed 7:45. I told him the kitchen was still open, which was technically true since I hadn't actually started any closing procedures yet. "Take any seat you'd like," I said, gesturing to the 15 empty tables that surrounded us, my voice carrying more warmth than I'd expected considering how defeated I'd felt just minutes earlier. He chose a booth near the window, sliding into the worn red vinyl with the careful movements of someone whose body was tired from travel. I grabbed a menu from behind the counter, one of the laminated ones my mother had designed 20 years ago with little illustrations of our signature dishes in the corners. As I walked it over to him, I noticed his clothes, expensive but understated, the kind of quality that didn't need logos or labels to prove its worth. "I have to be honest with you," I said as I set the menu down in front of him, watching his eyes scan the simple offerings that suddenly felt so inadequate. "We're just a small family diner. Nothing fancy, nothing trendy, just good, honest comfort food that's been feeding this town for over 40 years. I didn't know why I felt the need to explain. Maybe because he looked like the type of person who ate at places with words like gastronomy and artisanal on the menu. He looked up at me with those tired eyes and said something that caught me completely off guard. "That sounds absolutely perfect." And then he ordered my mother's pot roast, the dish that had started to feel like a relic of a bygone era, the meal that nobody seemed to want anymore. What happened next would shake me to my core, but I'll tell you about that in just a moment. I walked back to the kitchen, my heart beating a little faster than usual, though I couldn't explain why this particular customer made me nervous. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or maybe it was simply that I hadn't had anyone order my mother's pot roast in over 2 weeks, and I desperately wanted it to be good, to be remembered the way it deserved. The kitchen was my sanctuary, the place where my mother had taught me everything she knew, where her handwritten recipe card still hung on a corkboard above the prep station, yellowed with age and splattered with decades of cooking. I pulled the pot roast from the oven where it had been slow cooking for hours, the meat falling apart at the touch of my fork, surrounded by carrots, potatoes, and onions that had absorbed all those rich, savory flavors. As I plated the dish, adding a generous ladle of gravy and a sprig of fresh rosemary from the little herb garden I kept out back, I felt a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability, like I was serving up a piece of my soul on that white ceramic plate. If you're still watching, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens next is going to show you why sometimes the simplest things in life carry the most power. Have you ever poured your heart into something and wondered if anyone would truly appreciate it? That's exactly what I was feeling as I carried that plate across the empty diner, my reflection moving alongside me in the dark windows, the storm still raging outside like it was trying to wash away the whole world. I set the plate down in front of Marcus, along with silverware wrapped in a paper napkin, and for just a moment, our eyes met, and I saw something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. "This smells incredible," he said softly, and I noticed his shoulders relax slightly, like the aroma alone had started to ease whatever tension he'd been carrying. I told him to enjoy and started to walk away, but something made me pause near the counter, pretending to organize menus while really watching him from the corner of my eye. Marcus picked up his fork and knife with the careful precision of someone who had handled thousands of meals, cutting into the tender meat with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. I watched as he brought the first bite to his mouth, and in that moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath, the storm outside fading to a distant murmur, the fluorescent lights humming their eternal song above us. He chewed slowly, his eyes closing, and I saw his entire body language shift in a way that caught me completely off guard. His shoulders dropped, his jaw unclenched, and when he opened his eyes again, there was something glistening in them that looked suspiciously like unshed tears. I felt my own throat tighten, confused by this stranger's reaction to a simple pot roast, wondering what memory or emotion I had accidentally triggered with my mother's recipe. He sat there in silence for a long moment, fork suspended halfway to the plate, staring at the food like it had just revealed some profound truth to him. Then he took another bite, and another, and I could see him savoring each mouthful with an intensity that seemed almost spiritual, like he was trying to memorize every flavor, every texture, every sensation. I had served thousands of meals in this diner over the years, watched countless people eat my mother's recipes, but I had never seen anyone respond quite like this. It wasn't just appreciation or enjoyment, it was something deeper, something that reached past the taste buds and strayed into the territory of memory and emotion. Finally, he looked up at me, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with feeling. "How long has this recipe been in your family?" I found myself walking over to his booth, pulled by curiosity and something else I couldn't name, sensing that this moment was more significant than I understood. "My grandmother created it in 1982, I told him, leaning against the booth across from his, my arms crossed protectively over my chest. "She tweaked it for years until my mother said it was perfect, and my mother made it the same way for 40 years without changing a single ingredient or step." I watched as he took another bite, closing his eyes again, and I wondered what story was playing out behind those closed eyelids. "It tastes like home," he whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear him over the rain hammering against the windows. And then he said something that made my blood run cold, and my heart race at the same time. "I know who you are, and I think I know why I ended up here tonight." But before I could ask what he meant, he set down his fork and looked at me with an expression that held both apology and reverence. And I knew that whatever came next was going to change everything. Marcus Reed wiped his mouth with the paper napkin, his hands trembling slightly, and I noticed for the first time how exhausted he truly looked, like a man who had been running from something for far too long. "I need to tell you something," he began, his voice carrying a weight that made me sit down in the booth across from him without being invited, my legs suddenly feeling too weak to hold me up. The rain continued its assault on the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around us, isolating us from the rest of the world in this small circle of fluorescent light. "My name is Marcus Reed," he said, watching my face for recognition that didn't come because I had never heard that name before in my life. "I'm a food critic for Culinary Chronicles magazine, and I've been reviewing restaurants for 15 years, visiting over 2,000 establishments across 48 states." The words hung between us like smoke, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach, wondering if this was some kind of setup, some cruel cosmic joke where my dying diner would get a scathing review that would serve as its obituary. But then his expression softened, and he gestured to the half-eaten pot roast in front of him with something close to reverence in his movements. "I grew up in a small town in Vermont, not much different from this place, and my mother used to make a pot roast every Sunday after church," he said, his eyes distant now, looking through me rather than at me, seeing something from decades ago. "She passed away 7 years ago, and I haven't tasted anything that reminded me of her cooking until tonight, until this meal, until your mother's recipe somehow reached across time and space and brought me back to her kitchen." I watched as a single tear escaped down his cheek, which he quickly wiped away, embarrassed by his own vulnerability in front of a stranger. He told me how he'd spent the last decade chasing culinary innovation, reviewing restaurants with molecular gastronomy and deconstructed classics and foams and gels and presentations that looked like modern art. "I forgot what food is supposed to do," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not supposed to impress. It's supposed to connect, to comfort, to carry love from one person to another." Marcus explained that he'd been on his way to review an exclusive restaurant in Aspen, a place with a 6-month waiting list and a tasting menu that cost $400 per person. I was taking what my GPS promised was a faster route, and then the storm hit, and my rental car started making a terrible noise, and I pulled off at the first exit I saw, he said, shaking his head at the improbability of it all. He'd called the rental company, but they couldn't send anyone until morning because of the weather, and the nearest hotel was 30 miles away, on roads that were flooding. I saw your diner's sign through the rain, this glowing beacon in the darkness, and I thought I'd just wait out the worst of the storm and grab something quick to eat, he continued, picking up his fork again and taking another bite of the pot roast like he couldn't help himself. But what he'd found instead was something he hadn't even known he was looking for, a reminder of why he'd fallen in love with food in the first place, before the industry turned it into competition and criticism and impossible standards. "Do you know what's ironic?" Marcus asked, finally meeting my eyes again with a gaze that held both sadness and wonder. "Tomorrow, I'm supposed to write a review of that Aspen restaurant, the kind of place that will probably serve me 20 tiny courses on slate tiles and driftwood, each one more conceptual than the last." He paused, taking a sip of the water I'd brought him earlier, his hand steady now, the trembling gone. "But sitting here in your diner, eating this pot roast that probably costs $12 on the menu, I've had a more profound culinary experience than I've had in the last 5 years of fine dining." I didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if I should feel flattered or suspicious. So I just sat there in silence while the storm raged and this stranger poured out his heart to me over my mother's recipe. He told me about the pressure of his job, how every meal had become a test rather than a pleasure, how he'd trained himself to dissect and analyze rather than simply enjoy. "This pot roast," he said, gesturing to his now empty plate with a sad smile, "isn't technically perfect, you know." My heart sank at those words, but he continued before I could respond. "The meat is slightly tougher on one side, probably from uneven oven heat, and the carrots are cut inconsistently, and the presentation is about as simple as it gets." He listed these flaws like he was reading from a checklist, and I felt my defenses rising, ready to tell this fancy critic exactly where he could shove his expert opinion. "But none of that matters," he said softly, his voice carrying absolute conviction now, "because this meal has something that 99% of the restaurants I review are missing. It has soul, it has history, it has love baked into every bite, and it made me feel something I thought I'd lost forever." And then he asked me a question that would set everything in motion. "Would you let me write about this place, about your diner, about what this meal meant to me?" But I had no idea what saying yes to that question would unleash. I stared at Marcus Reed across that worn booth, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts at once, trying to process what this famous food critic was actually asking me. Write about my diner? About my mother's pot roast? The idea felt both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and being asked to jump without knowing if there was water below or jagged rocks waiting to break me. Part of me wanted to say yes immediately, to grab onto this unexpected lifeline that had literally walked through my door during a storm. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt and disappointed too many times, screamed at me to be careful, to protect what little I had left. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that might have been understanding, or maybe just pity. If you're feeling this tension right now, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what comes next will show you why taking risks can be the scariest and most important thing we ever do. Have you ever been offered something that could change your life but felt too afraid to reach for it? That's exactly where I was sitting in that moment, with opportunity staring me in the face and fear holding me back, like chains I couldn't see but could definitely feel. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his empty plate pushed to the side, and I could see genuine concern in his expression, not the calculated look of someone trying to use me for a story. "I understand your hesitation," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the authority or confidence he'd had earlier, just simple human empathy. "But I want you to know that I'm not interested in writing some gimmicky piece about a hidden gem or an undiscovered treasure. I want to tell the story of what this place really is." My mother's voice echoed in my head, something she used to say when I was young and afraid to try new things. "Ava, baby, the only way to fail is to never give yourself a chance to succeed." She'd been fearless in ways I never was, always believing that good food and honest work would be enough, even when the world seemed determined to prove her wrong. I thought about the stack of overdue bills in my desk drawer, the letter from the bank that I'd read so many times I'd memorized every crushing word, the empty tables that greeted me most nights now. What did I have to lose that I wasn't already losing anyway? inch by painful inch, day by exhausting day. What would you write about? I asked Marcus, needing to understand his intentions before I could even consider trusting him with something as precious as my family's legacy. Marcus sat back in the booth, his eyes moving around the diner with a gaze that seemed to see past the faded paint and worn furniture to something deeper underneath. I would write about tradition in a world that's obsessed with innovation, about the courage it takes to keep doing something the same way when everyone tells you to change, he said, his words coming slowly and deliberately, like he was discovering them as he spoke. I would write about your mother and grandmother, about recipes that carry more than just instructions for cooking, but also memories and love and history. He paused, looking directly at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable in its honesty. I would write about you, Ava, about a woman who's fighting to preserve something beautiful even when the odds are stacked against her, because that's a story people need to hear right now. His words hit me harder than I expected, bringing tears to my eyes that I blinked back furiously, refusing to cry in front of this stranger who somehow saw me more clearly than I saw myself. But doubt still gnawed at me, whispering its poison in the back of my mind, reminding me of every time I'd trusted someone and been disappointed, every promise that had turned out to be empty. What if he wrote something negative? What if his article brought people who expected something my humble diner couldn't deliver? What if this was just another way for the universe to set me up for an even harder fall? I need time to think about it, I finally said, standing up from the booth on shaky legs, needing distance and space to process everything that was happening. Marcus nodded, pulling out his wallet and placing 3 $20 bills on the table, far more than the pot roast cost, and when I tried to object, he held up his hand. The meal was worth every penny and more, he said simply. Then he wrote his phone number on a napkin and slid it across the table toward me. Take all the time you need, Ava, but I hope you'll call me, because I truly believe your story deserves to be told. And as I watched him walk back out into the storm, disappearing into the darkness and rain, I realized that the real storm was just beginning inside my own heart. I didn't sleep that night, lying in my small apartment above the diner, listening to the rain finally taper off into a soft drizzle. Marcus Reed's napkin with his phone number sitting on my nightstand, like a challenge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to accept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother standing in that kitchen, her hands covered in flour, her smile warm and genuine as she taught me how to roll pie dough, how to season a roast properly, how to put love into every dish we served. She had believed in this diner with every fiber of her being, had poured her entire life into making it a place where people felt welcomed and cared for, and now it was dying under my watch, withering away despite my best efforts to save it. By the time the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the previous night's storm, I had made my decision, and my hand was reaching for my phone before I could talk myself out of it. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice still heavy with sleep, and I realized with a start that it was only 6:30 in the morning. It's Ava Williams, I said, my voice shaking slightly with nerves and something that might have been hope trying to break through years of disappointment. From the diner last night, and I've been thinking about your offer, and I want to say yes, but I need you to promise me something first. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear him moving around, probably sitting up in whatever hotel room he'd ended up in after leaving my diner. Anything, he said simply, and I believed him, which was either the smartest or stupidest thing I'd done in years. Promise me you'll tell the truth, I said, my words coming faster now as confidence built in my chest. Not some romanticized version or a story designed to make people feel good, but the real truth about what this place is and what it means. Marcus kept his word in ways I never could have imagined, spending the next week visiting the diner multiple times, talking to our regular customers, learning about my mother and grandmother, even helping me prep vegetables one afternoon while I shared stories about growing up in that kitchen. He took notes constantly, but not in the clinical way I'd expected from a critic, more like someone documenting something precious that he was afraid might disappear if he didn't capture every detail. I watched him interview Mrs. Henderson, who'd been eating lunch at Williams' family diner 3 times a week for 37 years, And I saw tears in his eyes as she described how my grandmother's chicken soup had been the first thing she could keep down after her chemotherapy treatments decades ago. He photographed the handwritten recipe cards on the corkboard, the scratched and dented pots and pans that had cooked thousands of meals, the booth near the window where my father had proposed to my mother 40 years earlier. "This isn't just a restaurant," he told me on his last visit. "It's a living museum of love and perseverance." The article published 3 weeks later in Culinary Chronicles magazine, and within hours, my phone started ringing off the hook in a way it hadn't in years. Marcus had titled it, "The Last Keeper of Comfort, One Woman's Fight to Preserve Her Family's Culinary Legacy," and his words painted a picture of Williams' family diner that was so honest and beautiful, it made me cry when I first read it sitting alone at the counter before opening time. He wrote about the pot roast that had made him remember his mother, about my struggle to keep the doors open against impossible odds, about recipes that carried more than flavors but entire lifetimes of memory and tradition. He wrote about the chipped paint and worn booths not as flaws, but as evidence of decades of service, of meals shared, of a family that had given everything to feed their community. In an age where restaurants compete to be the most innovative, the most Instagram-worthy, the most conceptually daring, he wrote, Williams' Family Diner stands as a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply continuing to do something honest and beautiful the same way it's always been done. The response was overwhelming in ways I never anticipated, transforming my empty diner into a destination that people drove hours to experience. The phone rang constantly with reservation requests, even though we'd never taken reservations before. And by the weekend, there was a line of people waiting outside before we opened, all of them clutching printed copies of Marcus's article and asking to try my mother's pot roast. Local news stations called wanting to do stories, food bloggers showed up with cameras and ring lights, and my little diner that had been dying just weeks earlier suddenly became the most talked-about restaurant in 3 counties. I had to hire back the 2 servers I'd let go months earlier, and then hire 2 more on top of that. And for the first time in years, I went to bed at night without that crushing weight of fear and uncertainty pressing down on my chest. But what surprised me most wasn't the sudden success or the crowds, or even the money finally flowing back into the diner's account. It was the message I received from Marcus the day after his article published. "Thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with food in the first place. You saved more than your diner. You saved me too." And I realized that sometimes the people we think are rescuing us are actually the ones who needed rescuing all along. 3 months after Marcus Reed's article transformed Williams' Family Diner from a dying restaurant into a thriving destination, I received a text message that made my heart skip in a way I wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. "I'm driving through Maple Ridge tomorrow afternoon," the message read, "and I'd love to stop by and see how you're doing, if that's okay." I stared at my phone for a full minute, sitting in the office where I'd once cried over unpaid bills, now surrounded by reservation books filled with names and positive reviews printed from online sites. The diner had been packed every single day since the article published, sometimes with 2-hour wait times on weekends, and I'd hired 6 new employees to handle the rush that showed no signs of slowing down. Part of me was excited to show Marcus what his words had accomplished, but another part was nervous in a way that had nothing to do with business, and everything to do with the strange connection I'd felt with this man during that stormy night 3 months ago. Before we go any further, I need you to hit that subscribe button and smash that like button, because what happens when Marcus walks back through those doors will remind you why sometimes the people who help us the most are the ones who need our help just as badly. Have you ever reconnected with someone who changed your life and wondered if they remembered you the same way you remembered them? That's exactly the question spinning through my mind as I prepared for Marcus's visit, making sure the diner looked perfect, that we had extra portions of pot roast ready, that everything reflected the success his article had created. I caught myself checking my reflection in the kitchen's stainless steel surfaces more than once, which was ridiculous considering I'd spent the last 3 months covered in flour and grease with barely a thought about my appearance. My employees noticed my nervous energy, and my head server Carmen raised an eyebrow at me with a knowing smile that I pretended not to see. "Just a friend stopping by," I told her, but the words felt inadequate even as I said them. Marcus arrived at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, And the moment he walked through that door, I saw the shock register on his face as he took in the transformed diner. Every booth was full, every table occupied, with a group of people waiting near the entrance for the next available seating. The walls had been repainted, the old jukebox had been repaired, and was playing classic songs from the 50s and 60s, and there were framed copies of his article hanging alongside the old family photographs my mother had displayed decades ago. But what struck me most was the expression on Marcus's face, a mixture of pride and something deeper, almost like wonder, as he watched families laughing over plates of my mother's recipes, as he heard the buzz of conversation and the clink of silverware against plates. "Ava," he said softly when he finally made his way to where I stood near the counter, and the way he said my name carried weight I couldn't quite interpret. "This is incredible. This is everything I hoped would happen and more." I led Marcus to a quiet booth in the back corner, the same booth where he'd sat during that stormy night, and Carmen brought over 2 plates of pot roast without being asked, giving me a wink that made me blush. "Tell me everything," Marcus said, leaning forward with genuine interest lighting up his eyes. And so I did, sharing stories about the rush of customers, the challenges of scaling up while maintaining quality, the overwhelming gratitude I felt every single day. I told him about the elderly couple who'd driven 6 hours just to eat lunch at the diner where the husband's late mother had worked as a waitress in the 1970s. I told him about the food blogger who'd cried while eating my grandmother's apple pie because it reminded her of her own grandmother who'd passed away. I told him about the college student who'd applied for a job because she said the article made her want to be part of something that mattered. "You gave me my life back," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion I hadn't planned to show. "You saved this place, saved my family's legacy, and I don't know how to thank you for that." But Marcus shook his head, setting down his fork and reaching across the table to take my hand in a gesture that felt both natural and earth-shaking at the same time. "You're wrong, Ava," he said, his voice carrying the same vulnerability I'd heard that first night when he'd told me about his mother. "You saved me, because after I wrote that article about your diner, something shifted inside me that I can't fully explain." He told me that he'd quit his job at Culinary Chronicles magazine 2 weeks after the article published, tired of the pressure to be cynical, to find flaws, to treat food as something to be dissected rather than celebrated. He'd started freelance writing instead, focusing on stories like mine, on family restaurants and immigrant cuisines, and the ways food carries culture and memory across generations. "That night in your diner reminded me why I fell in love with food in the first place," he said, his thumb unconsciously stroking the back of my hand in a way that sent shivers up my arm. "It reminded me that the best meals aren't about technique or innovation. They're about connection and tradition and love." And then he said something that made my breath catch in my throat. "I was wondering if maybe you'd let me take you to dinner sometime, somewhere that's not here, where you're not working and I'm not reviewing, just 2 people sharing a meal." And suddenly the diner felt very warm and very bright, and I realized that maybe the real miracle wasn't the success of the restaurant, but the unexpected connection that had formed between 2 broken people who'd helped each other find their way back to something true. The weeks following Marcus's return visit passed in a blur of packed dining rooms and stolen moments between service rushes, phone calls that stretched late into the night, and a growing relationship that felt both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. But success, I was learning, came with its own set of challenges that nobody had warned me about. Complications that made me miss the simplicity of those quiet nights when the diner was empty and failing. The increased business meant increased expenses, more staff to manage, more inventory to order, more equipment that broke down from overuse, and suddenly I was dealing with problems I'd never imagined back when my biggest worry was whether I could pay the electric bill. Health inspectors came more frequently now that we were on their radar. Vendors tried to charge premium prices because they knew we were busy, and competitors started spreading rumors that our success was artificial, manufactured by a magazine article rather than earned through quality. I found myself working 16-hour days, exhausted in ways I'd never been even during the worst days of the diner's decline. And sometimes late at night, I wondered if this success was sustainable or just a temporary spike that would eventually crash. Marcus understood these struggles in ways my other friends couldn't, having seen countless restaurants rise and fall during his years as a critic. Success is harder than failure in some ways, he told me one evening as we sat in the closed diner after midnight, surrounded by the day's receipts and inventory lists. When you're failing, at least your path is clear. You know you need to change or die. But when you're succeeding, you have to figure out how to maintain that success without losing what made you special in the first place. His words struck deep because that was exactly my fear, that in trying to meet demand I would compromise quality, that in scaling up I would lose the soul that Marcus had written about so beautifully. I'd already caught myself considering shortcuts, pre-made sauces that could save time, frozen vegetables instead of fresh ones, shortcuts that would have horrified my mother but seemed tempting when facing a kitchen full of tickets and customers waiting for tables. "Don't do it," Marcus said firmly when I confessed these temptations. "The moment you compromise is the moment you become just another restaurant." The pressure intensified when a restaurant group from Denver contacted me with an offer to franchise Williams Family Diner, promising to open locations across Colorado and eventually nationwide. The money they offered was staggering, enough to secure my future for life, enough to never worry about bills or repairs or any of the financial stress that had haunted me for years. I sat in the lawyer's office reviewing the contract, looking at numbers that made my head spin, and part of me screamed to sign immediately to accept this validation and security. But the contract also specified standardized recipes, centralized food preparation, efficiency measures that would eliminate many of the time-consuming traditional methods my grandmother and mother had insisted on. "You'd become a brand consultant," the restaurant group's representative explained, "providing the authenticity and story while we handle operations." The word authenticity stuck in my throat like a bone, because how could something be authentic when it was manufactured in a central kitchen and shipped to locations across the country? I called Marcus from my car outside the lawyer's office, my hands shaking as I explained the offer and my confusion about what to do. "Tell me what to do," I begged, hating how desperate I sounded but unable to pretend I had the answer. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and when Marcus finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I can't tell you what to do, Ava, but I can tell you what I learned from watching hundreds of restaurants make this choice," he said. "The ones who franchise usually make a lot of money, and the ones who stay small usually struggle more, but the ones who franchise almost never stay special, and the ones who stay small sometimes become legendary." He reminded me of the restaurants he'd written about over the years, the family places that had resisted expansion for generations, that still had lines around the block decades after opening because they never compromised. "Your diner isn't successful because of the food alone," he said. "It's successful because people can feel your mother's presence in every dish, your grandmother's love in every recipe, your personal commitment in every detail, and you can't franchise that no matter how hard you try." I turned down the franchise offer the next day, and while part of me wondered if I was making a terrible mistake, a deeper part knew I'd made the only choice I could live with. The diner remained a single location, packed every day, with people willing to wait because they knew they were getting something real, something that couldn't be replicated or mass-produced. Marcus wrote a follow-up article 6 months later titled, "Why One Restaurant Owner Said No to Millions," exploring my decision and the broader question of what we lose when we prioritize growth over authenticity. The article sparked conversations across the food industry about sustainability versus expansion, about tradition versus innovation, about what success actually means when you strip away the money and the fame. And late at night, when I locked the diner's door and looked at the worn booths and old photographs and recipe cards written in my mother's handwriting, I felt a peace I'd never experienced during those desperate days of decline. I'd learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting to survive, but fighting to stay true to what matters most, even when the world offers you easier paths. 1 year after Marcus Reed's article changed everything, Williams Family Diner had become something I never imagined it could be. Not just a successful restaurant, but a symbol of resistance against a culture that valued novelty over tradition. The waiting list for weekend reservations stretched weeks in advance. Culinary students drove from Denver to study our traditional cooking methods, and food magazines called regularly asking for interviews about how we'd maintained authenticity in an age of expansion and franchising. But what meant more to me than any of that success was the letter I received from a woman in Montana whose grandmother had immigrated from Ireland 70 years earlier, with nothing but her recipes and her determination. "Your story gave me the courage to open my own restaurant using my grandmother's recipes," she wrote, her words blurring through my tears as I read them sitting alone in the office after closing time. "You showed me that there's value in preservation, that the old ways still matter, and I wanted to thank you for that gift. If this story is touching your heart right now, please hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what I'm about to share will show you how one decision can create ripples that spread far beyond anything you ever imagined." Have you ever wondered if your choices really matter in the grand scheme of things? That letter from Montana was just the first of hundreds I would receive over the coming months. Stories from people who'd been inspired to honor their own family traditions, to resist the pressure to modernize and compromise, to believe that what they had was already enough. Marcus helped me create a filing system for these letters, and sometimes late at night we'd sit together reading them, both of us moved to tears by the impact our story had created. A Filipino family in Texas opened a restaurant serving their grandmother's adobo recipe. A Syrian refugee in Michigan started a catering business specializing in the dishes his mother taught him before the war. A young black chef in Atlanta quit her job at a high-end fusion restaurant to open a soul food diner honoring her great-grandmother's cooking. Each story carried its own pain and triumph, its own battle between preservation and pressure, and each one reminded me why I'd said no to the franchise money. Marcus and I had grown closer over those 12 months, our relationship evolving from gratitude and friendship into something neither of us had been looking for, but both of us desperately needed. He'd relocated from New York to Maple Ridge 6 months earlier, taking a position as a freelance writer that allowed him to work from anywhere, and everyone in town knew we were together, even though we'd never made any formal announcement. He understood me in ways nobody else could, having witnessed both my lowest point and my resurrection, having seen the fear in my eyes that stormy night and the confidence that had grown since then. We'd talk for hours about food and memory, about the responsibility that comes with success, about the strange burden of becoming a symbol for something larger than yourself. "Sometimes I miss when the diner was empty, and nobody cared what I did," I confessed to him one night, and he'd laughed and pulled me close, understanding exactly what I meant because he felt the same pressure with his writing now, that people looked to him as some kind of authenticity crusader. But the success had also brought challenges I never anticipated, particularly from other struggling restaurant owners who felt I'd somehow cheated by getting media attention while they suffered in obscurity. A competing diner 2 towns over started a whisper campaign claiming that Marcus and I had been in a relationship before his article, that the whole thing was orchestrated rather than organic, that my success was built on deception rather than merit. The accusations stung, even though they were completely false, and I found myself lying awake at night wondering if people believed the rumors, if they thought less of me, if my mother would be ashamed of the controversy swirling around our family name. Marcus wanted to write a rebuttal, to set the record straight publicly, but I stopped him, knowing that engaging with the accusations would only give them more oxygen. "The food speaks for itself," I told him, repeating my mother's old wisdom. "People who want to believe the worst will find reasons no matter what we say, and people who believe in us don't need convincing." What got me through those difficult moments was remembering that night when Marcus first walked through my door, soaking wet and lost, looking for nothing more than a meal and finding something that changed both our lives forever. I thought about the journey from desperation to success, from loneliness to love, from a diner on the verge of closure to a thriving business that employed 15 people and fed hundreds every week. The rumors eventually faded, as they always do, replaced by new gossip and newer scandals, but the lessons remained. I'd learned that success attracts both genuine admiration and petty jealousy, that standing for something means becoming a target, that the price of visibility is vulnerability. But I'd also learned that staying true to your values, even when it costs you opportunities and opens you up to criticism, creates a foundation that can't be shaken by rumors or competition or the inevitable challenges that come with running a business. And as I stood in my mother's kitchen, preparing her pot roast recipe for the 1,000th time, I felt her presence surrounding me like a warm embrace, telling me she was proud, telling me I'd done right by her legacy, telling me the struggle was worth it. 2 years after that fateful stormy night, Marcus asked me to marry him in the same booth where he'd first tasted my mother's pot roast, presenting me with a ring that had belonged to his own mother and a promise to honor both our families' legacies together. The diner was closed for the proposal, just the two of us surrounded by the ghosts of meals served and memories made. And when I said yes through tears of joy, I felt the weight of generations lifting from my shoulders. No longer a burden I carried alone, but a gift I could share with someone who truly understood its value. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony in the diner's backyard, surrounded by family and the regular customers who'd become like family and Mrs. Henderson cried so hard during the vows that we had to pause twice for her to compose herself. Our wedding cake was my grandmother's recipe, baked by Carmen and the kitchen staff, and our first dance was to a song from the repaired jukebox that my parents had danced to on their own wedding day decades earlier. It felt like everything had come full circle, like all the pain and struggle and fear had been necessary preparation for this moment of complete joy and rightness. Williams' family diner continued to thrive, but more importantly, it evolved in ways that honored the past while embracing a sustainable future. Marcus and I started a mentorship program for young chefs interested in traditional cooking methods, hosting quarterly workshops where we shared my family's recipes and the stories behind them, teaching techniques that were being lost in culinary schools focused on modernist cuisine. We created a scholarship fund for culinary students from low-income families, remembering how my mother had once struggled to afford her own training, wanting to give others opportunities she never had. The diner itself remained intentionally small, resisting every offer to expand or franchise. But we started a cookbook project documenting not just recipes, but the oral histories of family cooking traditions from across our community. The book took 3 years to complete, featuring stories from 75 families representing 23 different cultural backgrounds, all of them united by the belief that food carries more than nutrition, but also identity, memory, and love passed down through generations. Looking back on everything that happened since that October storm, I'm struck by how many times I almost gave up, how close I came to letting fear win, how easily the entire story could have ended differently. If I'd closed early that night, Marcus would have driven past to the next town and never tasted the pot roast that changed both our lives. If I'd been too proud or too scared to accept his help, the article would never have been written, and the diner would likely be closed by now, another casualty of changing times and chain restaurant competition. If I'd taken the franchise money, I'd be wealthy but empty, having traded my soul for security, having compromised the very thing that made my story worth telling. Every decision point could have led to disaster, but somehow, through a combination of luck and stubbornness and the persistent voice of my mother's wisdom echoing in my head, I chose the harder right instead of the easier wrong, and that made all the difference. The real lesson I learned through this journey wasn't about business success or media attention, or even about preserving family traditions, though all those things mattered. The real lesson was about the invisible threads that connect us all, the ways that simple acts of authenticity and kindness ripple outward in patterns we can't predict or control. Marcus walked into my diner looking for a meal and found healing for grief he'd been carrying for years. I served him a pot roast thinking it was just another ordinary night, and received the catalyst that saved my family's legacy, those letters from around the country, those restaurants opened in honor of grandmothers and traditions, those families reunited around recipes they'd almost forgotten. None of it was planned or orchestrated. It was simply the natural result of two broken people being honest about their struggles and their values in a world that often rewards neither. We don't know whose lives we're touching when we choose integrity over convenience, when we preserve something beautiful even when it's not profitable, when we share our authentic selves instead of hiding behind polished facades. Marcus often jokes that the pot roast is the real hero of our story, and in a way he's right, because that simple dish carried my grandmother's determination, my mother's love, my own desperate hope, and something intangible that Marcus's mother had put into her own cooking decades earlier in Vermont. Food is a time machine when you think about it, a way for the dead to speak to the living, for one generation to literally nourish the next, for love to persist beyond memory into something you can taste and smell and share. Every time someone orders my mother's pot roast now, I think about all the hands that touched that recipe over the years, all the moments of joy and comfort it provided, all the ways it carried our family story forward into the world. And I think about that woman crying over the meal in a booth while rain hammered the windows outside, looking for nothing more than shelter from a storm, and finding instead a reason to remember why food matters, why tradition matters, why the simple act of cooking with love and serving with care can change everything. That's the legacy I want to leave behind when my own time comes. Not a chain of restaurants or a famous name, but the knowledge that I kept faith with those who came before me, that I preserved something worth preserving, and that maybe, just maybe, I inspired someone else to do the same. 5 years after Marcus Reed walked through my door during that October storm, Williams Family Diner had become more than just a successful restaurant. It had become a symbol of hope for anyone struggling to preserve something meaningful in a world that constantly demands change and innovation. I received letters daily from people across North America who'd read Marcus's articles or heard about our story through word of mouth, each one sharing their own battles with tradition versus modernization, authenticity versus profit, heart versus head. A grandmother in Nova Scotia wrote to tell me she'd decided not to sell her bakery after reading our story, choosing instead to pass it to her granddaughter who'd promised to keep making the same butter tarts that had fed their community for 60 years. A young immigrant chef in Toronto opened a restaurant serving his father's recipes from Pakistan, despite consultants telling him to modernize and appeal to Western palates, because our story reminded him that authenticity was worth fighting for even when the odds seemed impossible. The documentary filmmaker who contacted us last year wanted to capture what she called the Williams Family Diner phenomenon, but I insisted that our story wasn't unique or phenomenal. It was simply what happens when people choose to honor the past while building the future. We spent 3 months filming, capturing not just the busy lunch rushes and satisfied customers, but also the quiet moments in the early morning when I prepped vegetables the same way my grandmother had taught me, when Marcus sat at the counter drinking coffee and writing about food traditions from around the world, when our children played in the dining room that had witnessed so much struggle and triumph over 4 decades. The filmmaker asked me what I thought made our story resonate with so many people, and I realized it wasn't about the food, or even the success. It was about the universal human need to feel connected to something larger than ourselves, to believe that what we do matters beyond our individual lives, to know that the struggles we face aren't meaningless, but rather part of a bigger story that continues long after we're gone. Marcus often reflected on how that stormy night changed his entire career trajectory, pulling him away from the cynical world of professional criticism and into the more fulfilling work of celebrating culinary traditions and the people who preserve them. His new book, Recipes for Resistance: How Traditional Cooking Fights Back Against Food Industry Conformity, had just been published and was getting attention from major media outlets who wanted to interview him about the movement he'd accidentally helped create. "I didn't start a movement," he always insisted when asked. "I just told a true story about a woman who refused to give up on something beautiful. And that story resonated because deep down we're all tired of being told that newer is always better and tradition is just nostalgia holding us back." He'd become a sought-after speaker at culinary schools and food conferences, always emphasizing that technical skill without soul produces meals that satisfy hunger, but not the deeper human need for connection and meaning. The most powerful moment came when we hosted a gathering at the diner for restaurant owners who'd been inspired by our story. 37 people from 11 states who'd driven or flown to Maple Ridge specifically to meet us and share their own journeys. We closed the diner for a Sunday evening and cooked together, each person bringing a signature family dish and the story behind it. And as we sat around pushed-together tables eating and laughing and crying together, I felt my mother's presence so strongly it took my breath away. This was what she'd always believed food could do: break down barriers between strangers, create family where there was none before, remind us that despite our different backgrounds and experiences, we're all fundamentally the same, all hungry for more than just physical sustenance. A woman from Louisiana who ran a Creole restaurant her great-grandmother had founded stood up and proposed a toast. "To Ava and Marcus, for reminding us that the most revolutionary act in a world obsessed with innovation is simply continuing to do something honest and beautiful the way it's always been done. Looking around that room full of people who'd traveled so far because of a pot roast served during a storm 5 years ago, I understood that the real legacy of that night wasn't the success of my diner or Marcus's career transformation, or even the preservation of my family's recipes. It was the permission we'd given others to trust their own instincts, to value their own traditions, to believe that what they had was already enough without needing to constantly chase what was newer or trendier, or more Instagram-worthy. Every person in that room represented dozens or hundreds or thousands of customers who were being fed not just meals, but also connection to tradition, to memory, to the hands that had cooked those same dishes generations before. And every one of those customers would carry those experiences forward, would tell their children about the restaurant where the food reminded them of their grandmother's kitchen, would maybe preserve their own family recipes because they'd been reminded that such preservation matters. That's how change happens, not through grand gestures or viral moments, but through small acts of integrity repeated over time, creating ripples that spread farther than we can ever measure or understand. So after hearing my entire story, from that desperate night when I stood alone in an empty diner wondering if I should give up, to this moment 5 years later surrounded by success and love and purpose I never imagined possible, I want to ask you something important. What would you have done in my place? When Marcus offered to write about my struggling diner, would you have trusted him, or would fear have made you say no? When the franchise group offered millions of dollars to expand and standardize my family's recipes, would you have taken the money, or would you have trusted that staying authentic mattered more than getting rich? These aren't just questions about my story. They're questions about your own life, about the moments when you face choices, between what's easy and what's right, between compromising who you are and staying true to your deepest values even when nobody's watching and nobody would blame you for taking the easier path. Do you believe that one meal, one moment, one decision can really change the entire trajectory of a life? Because I'm living proof that it can, that a simple pot roast served with care and honoring my mother's tradition created a chain of events that transformed not just my diner, but my entire existence, giving me love and partnership and purpose where there had been only loneliness and fear and the slow grinding loss of everything I'd tried to build. Marcus is living proof too, that allowing yourself to be vulnerable, to remember what you've lost, to connect authentically with another person, can heal wounds you didn't even know you were carrying. And those 37 restaurant owners who came to my diner last month, and the hundreds more who've written letters, and the thousands of customers who've found connection and comfort in our recipes, they're all living proof that authenticity creates ripples we can't predict or control, but that spread farther than cynicism or compromise ever could. After hearing my story, what's your take on preservation versus innovation? Do you think I made the right choice turning down the franchise money? Or do you think I was foolish to reject financial security in favor of staying small and authentic? I genuinely want to know what you think. So leave your thoughts in the comments below, and let's start a conversation about what really matters in this life we're all trying to navigate. Tell me about your own family traditions, the recipes or practices or values you're trying to preserve in a world that constantly demands you move on and embrace whatever's newest. Tell me about the moments when you had to choose between what was easy and what was right, and which choice you made, and whether you regret it or feel proud of it. This community we're building here isn't just about watching videos. It's about supporting each other in the ongoing struggle to live with integrity and purpose and connection to something larger than our individual ambitions. If you want more stories like this that explore how food connects us to memory, tradition, and each other, if you want to be part of a community that values authenticity over appearance and substance over style, then make sure you subscribe to this channel right now and turn on those notifications so you never miss what comes next. Marcus and I have so many more stories to share, interviews with other people who've chosen the harder right over the easier wrong, conversations about what it means to build a life of meaning rather than just a life of success. In our next video, I'll be sharing what happened when a famous food blogger tried to expose our diner as a fraud, claiming that no family restaurant could maintain the quality we were delivering at our scale, and how that controversy almost destroyed everything we'd built, but ultimately made us stronger. You won't want to miss that story, because it taught me lessons about trust and community that I'm still processing today. Thank you for spending this time with me, for listening to my story, for caring about these issues that matter so much, not just to me, but to everyone who's trying to preserve something beautiful in a world that often values efficiency over authenticity. Remember that every meal you prepare with love, every tradition you honor, every moment you choose integrity over convenience, you're creating ripples that spread far beyond what you can see, touching lives you'll never meet in ways you'll never fully understand. That's the most beautiful legacy any of us can leave behind, not wealth or fame or impressive achievements, but the knowledge that we stayed true to what mattered most, that we preserved something worth preserving, that we chose connection over competition and authenticity over appearance. Until next time, keep cooking with love, keep honoring your traditions, and keep believing that what you have is already enough. You don't need to be anything other than your most authentic self. I'll see you in the next video, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts in the comments below.